The night was unnaturally quiet in Tokyo, as the members of Japan's highest military council gathered behind the sealed doors of the Imperial Palace compound. Outside, the winter air bit at the guards' faces, but inside the conference hall, lined with dark wood, paper lanterns, and the faint smell of incense, the atmosphere was suffocating. It was here, in this heavily guarded chamber, that Japan's future would be decided. And for the first time since the Pearl Harbor plan had been conceived, the room was filled not with confidence, but with doubt. At the head of the table sat Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, his expression carved in stone. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, yet even he could not hide the strain of the last few days. Across from him sat the admirals of the Imperial Navy and the generals of the Imperial Army, two factions who rarely agreed on anything, yet were now bound together by a single, looming question. Should Japan really strike Pearl Harbor, or pull back before disaster struck? For weeks, whispers of hesitation had been growing behind closed doors. Intelligence officers warned that the United States industrial machine was far larger than expected. Financial advisors whispered that Japan had only 2 years of fuel reserves left. Diplomats insisted that negotiations in Washington might still succeed. And most alarming of all, several naval strategists, men who had remained silent for fear of dishonor, began to speak up. Tojo opened the meeting with a voice heavy yet controlled. "Gentlemen," he said, "we stand at the edge of a decision that will shape our empire for 1,000 years. Tonight, you must speak freely." It was an invitation no one truly wanted. Admiral Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, was the first to rise. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear of the Americans, but from fear of his own words. "If we attack," he began, "we awaken a giant whose strength we cannot match. The United States will not negotiate after being struck. They will seek total war." A murmur rippled across the table. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor Plan, leaned forward. His face was pale, his eyes dark, with both brilliance and foreboding. "I know the risks," he said quietly. "I have studied America. I have visited their factories. If we fight them in a prolonged war, we will lose. But if we do not neutralize their fleet now, they will strangle us with their industry." It was a terrible truth, delivered with calm certainty. The Army generals watched the naval debate with mounting tension. Japan was already bogged down in China. Resources were vanishing. The empire was stretched to its limit. A war with the United States would either save them or destroy them. General Sugiyama finally stood. "Our situation is desperate," he admitted, "but an attack of this scale, we risk provoking not just America, but Britain, Australia, and the entire Western world. Are we prepared to fight all of them at once?" The room fell silent. No one answered. For the first time, the War Council felt the crushing weight of reality. The Pearl Harbor Plan, bold, brilliant, almost mythic, was no longer a symbol of strength. It was a gamble that could obliterate the empire. Hours passed. Voices rose. Tempers flared. At one point, 2 senior officers had to be physically separated. The lantern light flickered across the strained faces of men caught between duty and dread. And then it happened, something no one expected. A senior Navy minister, white-haired and soft-spoken, broke the chaos with a single, trembling sentence. "If we attack, and we are wrong, Japan will cease to exist." No one dared speak after that. It was the moment when the room truly broke, when even the most hawkish leaders felt doubt pierce their resolve. No vote was yet taken, no decision yet reached. But on this night, inside a silent palace hall, the attack on Pearl Harbor stood closer to cancellation than at any other moment in history. This was the night when the Japanese High Command felt fear for the first time, and it would haunt them until the final decision was made. The morning after the chaotic midnight meeting, the sun rose over Tokyo's naval district like a blade of pale gold. Sharp, cold, unforgiving. Inside the Naval General Staff building, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone at the window of his office, watching the city begin its day. The streets bustled with civilians, unaware that, behind closed doors, the Empire's fate teetered on the edge of a decision he had forced into motion. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing again the echoes of the previous night's arguments. Doubt had seeped into every corner of the High Command, but now all eyes rested on him, the architect of the plan, the man gambling Japan's survival on a single, devastating blow. To Yamamoto, Pearl Harbor wasn't an act of bold conquest. It was a desperate preemptive strike, a temporary advantage in a war he believed Japan could not win if it dragged on. He had said it countless times in private. If I am ordered to fight, I will run wild for 6 months. After that, I can guarantee nothing. But many of his fellow admirals saw his vision as reckless, an unnecessary provocation of a giant that still slept. The corridor outside suddenly echoed with footsteps. Vice Admiral Nagumo, commander of the strike force, arrived with a group of senior naval officers. Their faces were stern, their expressions carved with unspoken concerns. Yamamoto turned as they entered the room, and the mood instantly shifted to tension-laced formality. Nagumo spoke first. Admiral, the fleet is preparing for departure, but there are serious worries among my staff. Some question whether our carriers are ready for such a prolonged operation in the Northern Pacific. Another admiral, Takihiro Nisi, crossed his arms, and some question the plan itself. The Americans may spot us early. Their carriers may be absent. Weather might delay us. If any of these occur, what remains of your decisive blow? There was no hostility in his tone, only fear. Yamamoto walked slowly to the table, where maps of the Pacific Ocean lay spread out. He placed a fingertip on Hawaii, then dragged it across the ocean toward Japan. 4 years, he began quietly. Our naval doctrine has been built on the idea of a decisive battle. One moment where we crush the enemy's main fleet and secure our dominance. The Americans know this. They expect us to fight by that doctrine. He tapped the map again. But Pearl Harbor is the one place where we can strike the Americans before they are ready, before they can assemble their full power. It is our only hope to secure time, months, perhaps a year, before the tide turns inevitably against us. Nishi exhaled sharply. Or push them into a war they will fight with everything they possess. Yamamoto met his gaze. They will fight us eventually. The question is whether we strike first on terms favorable to us, or wait for their news to tighten. Nagumo paced. Many in the fleet believe this plan places too much faith in luck. War is luck, Yamamoto answered, but it is also vision. Without bold action, we condemn ourselves to slow defeat. With bold action, we gain time. Time to fortify, time to negotiate, time to breathe. The room fell silent. No one could deny Yamamoto's brilliance. No one doubted his intellect. But his plan demanded perfection, and perfection was rare in war. A young staff officer finally spoke, his voice shaking slightly. Admiral, if these fails, Japan will face consequences beyond anything we have prepared for. Yamamoto nodded slowly, then prayed does not fail. Outside the office, the winter wind began to rise, rattling the glass panes. In that moment, the admirals knew the truth. Yamamoto's plan was not simply a military operation. It was a gamble of existential scale, a gamble that divided the Navy, a gamble that would commit Japan to a war far larger, far longer, and far deadlier than any of them could fully grasp. And yet, with each hour that passed, turning back became less possible. The machinery of war was already grinding forward. Pushed by Yamamoto's vision and the Empire's desperation, the gamble was underway. Whether Japan would rise or fall by, it remained to be seen. Tokyo, late autumn of 1941, smelled of burning charcoal, cold metal, and restless anticipation. Beneath the calm surface of the capital, Japan trembled with a conflict far older than Pearl Harbor. It was not a battle against America, not yet. It was a battle within itself. The Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy. To rival forces meant to defend the same nation stood locked in a bitter ideological war over the Empire's future. While the public saw unity and discipline, behind the curtain lay years of rivalry, resentment, and political sabotage. In a quiet, dimly lit conference chamber of the Imperial General Headquarters, the tension was thick enough to cut. Army generals arrived in rigid formation, their khaki uniforms sharp and cold. Naval officers entered with their dark coats and gold-embroidered caps. They sat on opposite sides of a long table, symbolic of a divide that had never fully healed. General Toyo, now Prime Minister, opened the meeting with clipped authority. We face a crossroads, he announced. Negotiations with the United States are failing. Oil reserves continued to dwindle. If we do not seize resources soon, this nation will choke. A murmur of agreement rose from the army side. Tojo's men had been pushing for conflict in Southeast Asia for years. To them, Pearl Harbor was a distraction, an unnecessary naval fantasy. Across the table, Admiral Nagano cleared his throat. General Tojo, the Navy does not deny a resource crisis, but war with the United States must be approached with precision. A premature strike could doom the empire before it begins. Tojo's eyes narrowed. The Navy has delayed action long enough. A chill swept through the room. The Navy believed in swift, decisive naval engagements. The Army believed in expansion across Asia and saw the Navy as reluctant partners. Neither side fully trusted the other, and now, at the center of this rift, sat Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor plan, an explosive idea that threatened to widen the divide. Admiral Ozawa leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. The Army demands war at once, but it does not understand the scale of the opponent. America's industry alone dwarfs ours tenfold. Without surprise, without crippling their Navy at the very beginning, a long war cannot be won. General Sugiyama slammed his palm on the table. And your surprise attack risks provoking them into a fury that will crush us even faster. The room erupted, voices overlapping, tempers flaring. Your army adventures in China drained our resources, and your ships consume fuel we no longer have. Your strategies caused international outrage, and your fleets failed to support our campaigns. Every sentence was a wound reopened. Only Yamamoto remained silent, watching the storm he knew was inevitable. At last, Tojo raised a hand, restoring order. Enough. His voice carried weight, but not unity. We must decide together. If we strike at Pearl Harbor, the Navy promises a swift, devastating blow. But the Army must understand. This will awaken a giant. Admiral Nagano leaned back, the fatigue visible in his eyes. And if we don't strike, he said softly, we face slow suffocation. The blockade will tighten. Our oil reserves will dry up. Our fleets will rust in port. We will go to war eventually, but with no strength left. For a brief moment, silence settled over the room. Heavy, suffocating. Everyone understood the truth. Japan's future now depended not only on strategy, but on whether its two powerful military branches could align, even reluctantly, on one path. In that moment, Yamamoto spoke, his tone calm but unyielding. The United States will not bend. The world will not wait. If we act, it must be soon, and it must be together. The Army generals exchanged glances. The Navy officers stiffened. Japan was a nation split, ideologically, strategically, internally. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor was not born from unity. It was born from conflict, from fear, from pride, and from the fragile, uneasy compromise forged in that room. A compromise that would carry Japan toward a war from which it could never return unchanged. Tokyo, early December 1941. The winter wind swept through the corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters, as though trying to deliver one final warning, one last breath of caution before the storm. But inside, the men who shaped Japan's fate were already committed, already leaning toward a decision they believed could change history. What they didn't know was how many voices had tried, desperately, to stop them. In a small, smoke-filled room away from the main council chamber, a group of Japan's intelligence officers gathered around a stack of intercepted messages and diplomatic cables. Their faces were pale, hardened by the weight of what they had seen coming. Lieutenant Commander Tadahiko Koga pointed at a decoded report spread across the table. Gentlemen, American suspicion is rising. Our diplomats in Washington fear negotiations are collapsing. If we attack Pearl Harbor, we will lose any advantage of surprise unless immediate action is taken. Commander Sunio Okamura rubbed his temples. The Navy High Command must hear this, he muttered. If they ignore the signs, we walk into a disaster. But the warnings had already been sent multiple times, and multiple times. They had been overshadowed by ambition, pride, and political momentum. Across Tokyo, at the Imperial Navy Ministry, Admiral Shigeru Fukudome stood before a panel of senior officers, presenting yet another intelligence briefing. His tone was controlled, but beneath it lay frustration. Reports from the United States indicate unusual silence from their Pacific Fleet. Reconnaissance flights are fewer. Communications are restricted. We cannot rule out the possibility that they anticipate a Japanese attack. A few Admiralty members exchanged uneasy glances. Admiral Nagumo, slated to lead the Pearl Harbor strike, shifted uncomfortably. But Admiral Nagano, the Chief of Naval General Staff, remained unmoved. America is complacent, he insisted. Their fleet is unprepared. Their forces are stretched thin. The time for hesitation has passed. Fukudome swallowed his objection. He had served long enough to know logic could not penetrate the echo chamber of determination that now surrounded the plan. Meanwhile, at the Army General Staff, Colonel Masanobu Tsuji reviewed intelligence from Japanese spies across Southeast Asia and Washington. His conclusions were stark. America is not blind. Their codebreakers are tracking our diplomatic patterns. They sense our moves towards southern expansion. If we strike the Pacific Fleet, all-out war will follow. General Tojo listened, but his jaw remained set. War is inevitable, he sighed coldly. What matters is striking first. For every voice of caution, there was a louder voice, demanding action. In Washington, Japanese diplomats were sending desperate messages back home, messages that went unread until it was too late. Ambassador Nomura and Special Envoy Kurosu repeatedly pleaded. The Americans are rearming rapidly. Their production is accelerating. If war comes later, we will be crushed sooner. Their warnings were filed, not heeded. Back in Tokyo, in an office lit only by a single desk lamp, a young intelligence analyst named Hiroshi Ima prepared a final report summarizing the risks of Pearl Harbor warnings about American industrial capacity, naval resilience, and public resolve. He delivered it to the Naval General Staff. It was quietly set aside, not because it lacked truth, but because the machinery of war planning was already grinding forward. The decision had momentum. Dissent was considered obstruction, and the Council believed that hesitation would doom them even faster than war. By December 4th, the final intelligence warnings, the last chance to stop the attack, had been drowned beneath the tides of ambition, fear, and inevitability. Japan's leaders had convinced themselves that surprise was certain, that America would break, that history could be bent by daring. But in the shadows of Tokyo, the intelligence community watched with quiet dread, knowing the truth. They had seen the storm coming. They had shouted into the void. And now, with every ignored report and every dismissed warning, Japan was sailing full speed toward a war it could not truly win. The voices of caution were not defeated. They were silenced. Tokyo, December 1941. The city glowed under a pale winter moon. But inside the halls of power, darkness, not nightfall, pressed against the minds of Japan's leaders. The Pearl Harbor plan was nearly finalized. Orders had been drafted. Fleets were already moving. And yet, within the highest circles of Japan's military and political elite, a deeper, quieter conflict began to take hold. A conflict not of strategy, but of conscience. For the first time since the operation's conception, a question, painful and forbidden, started circulating in hushed tones. Are we inviting the destruction of Japan? The first to give voice to the fear was Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, former Navy minister and one of the most respected elder statesmen. He sat in the dimly lit office of a fellow admiral, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the latest intelligence report. America's industrial capacity dwarfs ours tenfold, he whispered. If we strike first, their response will be merciless. His colleague, Admiral Inoue, leaned back, staring at the ceiling. It is madness, he murmured. I have said it from the beginning. A blow like this might achieve surprise, but it will guarantee a war we cannot sustain. Yonai nodded gravely. And if Japan burns, he sighed softly, our blood will be on the hands of every man who remains silent. Meanwhile, in the Army Ministry, a similar unease spread among younger officers. Captain Ishida, an operations planner, confronted his superior late one night. "Sir, with all due respect, we are provoking a giant. Do we truly believe we can win a prolonged war?" General Sugiyama's expression hardened, though a momentary flicker of doubt passed behind his eyes. "No nation wins by doubting itself," he replied. "History favors those who act decisively." "But at what cost?" Ishida pressed. "Our cities, our children, our future." Sugiyama dismissed him with a wave, but the words lingered like smoke in the air long after the captain left. Doubt had found its way into rooms once sealed by ambition and pride. Even Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, usually unwavering, began to feel the weight of possible catastrophe. Late at night he sat in his study, reading private letters from citizens. Some demanded honor and defiance. Others begged for peace. One letter, from a schoolteacher in Osaka, struck him deeply. "If our leaders choose war, 10, remember every child you send into the fire could be your own. We trust you to choose a future, not a grave." Tojo closed the letter and stared at the floor. Responsibility was no longer abstract. It was personal, intimate, almost unbearable. Within the Imperial Palace, a few advisors attempted to warn Emperor Hirohito of the danger. Privy Council President Hera sat with the Emperor during a quiet evening session. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "there are those who fear this path leads not to victory, but to annihilation. A war with the United States is not like previous wars. Their strength is inconceivable." Hirohito listened, his face unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, rumors of hesitation filtered through the Navy staff offices. Some officers whispered of resignations, others discussed the unthinkable, directly challenging the operation. But each knew what such defiance risked. Disgrace, removal, perhaps worse. Still, the question haunted them. If we go through with this, do we doom our nation? Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the plan, sensed the rising moral crisis. During a private gathering with trusted subordinates, he spoke with unprecedented candor. "I am not blind," he said quietly. "If the war continues for more than 6 months, we will lose. If it continues for a year, Japan will face devastation." His men stared at him in shock. "Then why proceed, sir?" "One, ask it." Yamamoto took a long breath, eyes heavy. "Because those who fear war are no longer in control. The tide has already swept forward. Now we can only ride the wave, and pray it does not drown us." By December 5th, the moral crisis had reached its peak, but it would not stop the attack. The voices of conscience were powerful, heartfelt, and prophetic, but they could not overpower momentum, pride, and the belief, however misguided, that a single bold stroke could reshape destiny. And so, Japan marched toward Pearl Harbor. Not with unity, but with a shadow hanging over every decision. A silent fear that in seeking victory, they might be signing Japan's death warrant. The quiet halls of the Imperial Palace felt almost sacred, insulated from the frenzied arguments boiling within Japan's military ministries. Yet in early December 1941, the same tension that gripped the War Council seeped into these marble corridors. Advisors moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones, aware that the fate of the empire now revolved around a single, enigmatic figure, Emperor. He was not a general, not a strategist, not a frontline leader, but he was the embodiment of Japan, a divine symbol whose words, or lack thereof, could shift the course of history. As the debate over the Pearl Harbor attack reached its climax, Hirohito found himself at the center of a storm. The army demanded expansion. The Navy warned of limits. Moderates urged caution. And yet, the Emperor remained a shadow, observing, listening, but offering almost nothing. Inside the palace, the senior aide-de-camp, General Hasegawa, confided to a colleague one night, "His Majesty senses the danger. I can see it in his eyes, but he will not oppose the generals, not openly." This was the tragedy of Hirohito's position, revered as a god, constrained as a man. On December 1st, the Imperial Conference convened. It was the final gathering where Hirohito could, in theory, halt the march to war. The room filled with Japan's most powerful leaders. Prime Minister Admiral Yamamoto as representatives, War Minister Sugiyama, Navy Minister Shimada, foreign policy officials, and members of the Privy Council, as tradition dictated. They spoke first. Sugiyama argued for striking Pearl Harbor as a necessity, a blow to crippled American interference in Asia. Shimada echoed him with naval confidence. We will win the opening phase decisively. Tojo insisted diplomacy had failed and Japan had been cornered. Only Privy Council President Hara dared to voice an alternative. Your Majesty, he said, turning toward the Emperor with rare boldness. If we initiate hostilities with the United States, we are accepting a war whose end we cannot foresee. I fear it may bring calamity upon the Empire. The room fell silent. All eyes shifted to Hirohito. This was the moment, the single breath, where he could have altered the trajectory of the world. But Hirohito did not openly challenge the military. Instead, he asked a single, quiet question. Is there no possibility of resolving this matter through continued diplomacy? Sugiyama straightened, desperately eager to reassure him. We have explored every avenue, Your Majesty, he replied. War is unavoidable. Historians would later discover that this was not entirely true. Diplomacy was strained. Yes, but not dead. Yet Hirohito accepted the military's presentation, whether out of trust, fear of overstepping his symbolic role, or belief that resistance would be futile. He chose not to oppose the plan. The advisors glanced at one another. Each was an oath. The Emperor had spoken, however softly. From that point on, Hirohito's silence became consent. That night, after the conference ended, the Emperor retired to his private quarters. Eyewitnesses described him as unusually solemn. He sat for a long time reviewing reports of American industry, the British Empire's global reach, and Japan's dwindling resources. The implications were clear. He knew the risks. He understood the potential cost, but he also understood the machinery of Japanese militarism, and that once it gathered momentum, even the Emperor struggled to stop it. In the early hours of December 2nd, Hirohito wrote a brief private note, later discovered by post-war investigators. My heart is heavy. The path we walk is shrouded in uncertainty. May the nation have the strength to endure what comes. It was not a command, not a protest, not a veto, just a quiet acknowledgement of a fate already set in motion. The attack on Pearl Harbor was no longer a plan, no longer a debate. It had become destiny, and Hirohito's silence, deliberate or resigned, sealed Japan's course toward war, triumph, suffering, and ultimately, ruin. Tokyo, December 5th, 1941. The winter wind scraped against the wooden frames of the Naval General Staff Building as the most consequential meeting in Japan, as modern history unfolded behind closed doors. Outside, the city went about its evening routines, unaware that the fate of the Pearl Harbor strike, an operation already days in motion, hung by a thread. Inside the dimly lit War Council chamber, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Maps of Hawaii covered the walls. Reconnaissance diagrams lay scattered across the table, and in the center sat the 6 men who held the power to either unleash or halt the attack. Japan's Supreme War Council. 5 votes would determine war. 1 vote, a single voice of dissent, could still stop it. The meeting began with the customary formality, but the usual certainty had vanished. Anxiety twisted through every sentence. Almost everyone knew that fleets had sailed, pilots trained, torpedoes modified. But until this council formalized approval, the operation remained suspended in a strange twilight. Neither war nor peace. The first to speak was Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, his face pale from sleepless nights. Hirose slowly clearing his throat before addressing the table. Gentlemen, I must speak plainly. Our negotiations with the United States have not yet reached an absolute dead end. On say we attack diplomacy is impossible. I cannot in good conscience say we have no alternatives left. A murmur rippled across the room. This was dangerous terrain. War Minister Sugiyama immediately countered. Diplomacy has failed. The Americans demand we abandon everything we have gained. If we do nothing, we die slowly. If we strike, we seize the initiative. Navy Minister Shimada nodded stiffly. The Pearl Harbor operation is prepared. The fleet awaits only our confirmation. To hesitate now is to risk disaster. But Togo did not retreat. What of the consequences of challenge? Our oil reserves will last only 2 years. America can outproduce us tenfold. Are we truly prepared for a prolonged war? From the corner of the room, an unexpected voice joined him. Navy Chief of Staff, Osami Nagano. Normally a loyal supporter of the plan, his tone was cold, grave. I must admit, I have reservations. The risk is enormous. If we fail to destroy their carriers, or if they rebuild quickly, Japan will face a war. Silence smothered the chamber. 2 voices of doubt. It only took one more to stall the plan entirely. Prime Minister Tojo felt the council slipping, and for the first time that night, panic crept into his voice. Understand this. Japan stands at the edge of survival. The United States tightens the noose each month. If we retreat today, we abandon our destiny. He turned toward Nagano, eyes sharp. Admiral, if we withdraw now, what becomes of the fleet already at sea? Nagano hesitated. It was the longest 3 seconds in the room. They can still be recalled, he said quietly, but it must be now. Tonight, every man felt the weight of those words. The entire Pearl Harbor force, 6 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of sailors, could still turn back. Then came the pivotal moment. The council called for a final vote. Tojo voted yes. Sugiyama voted yes. Shimada voted yes, then Kametogo. He paused, hands trembling slightly. The room froze. At last, he whispered, "No, I oppose the attack." A shockwave washed through the chamber. Only one more dissenting vote was needed. All eyes locked on Admiral Nagano. He looked down at the table, at the maps, at the thousands of sailors now heading across the Pacific, and finally, at Tojo. Moments passed like hours. Then he exhaled. "I vote yes. The operation proceeds." Togo shut his eyes. The chance, small, fleeting, fragile, had died. The Pearl Harbor attack lived. With that, the last obstacle vanished. The Supreme War Council rose, bowed, and signed the final authorization. Outside, the winter wind still howled, but now it carried the weight of war. Japan had chosen its path, and the world would never be the same again. The early hours of December 6, 1941, were marked by a tense, suffocating quiet in Tokyo. But inside the War Council chambers, time had become a relentless adversary. Japan's leaders faced a chilling reality. The clock was ticking, and every second of delay could jeopardize their plans or their nation's survival. 4 months, Japan's military strategists had been racing against an invisible but omnipresent enemy. Scarcity. Oil reserves were dwindling rapidly. Iron and steel shipments were running low, and every day that passed without decisive action increased the risk of strategic paralysis. By December 1941, Japan had calculated that the United States industrial might would inevitably crush its ambitions, unless it struck first. The Pearl Harbor operation was not merely a military mission. It was a desperate gamble against time itself. Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind. Behind the surprise attack, paced the War Council room, his fingers brushing against the intricate maps of the Hawaiian Islands. The tension was palpable. He understood the stakes. Delay would not bring more options. It would only amplify peril. Each passing hour allowed the U.S. fleet to reposition, shore up defenses, and fortify its Pacific presence. The meticulously trained Japanese carrier strike force could not remain idle indefinitely. Every moment of hesitation threatened to unravel months of preparation. The generals and admirals present were acutely aware that they were playing against time and human error. The fleet was already underway, thousands of miles across the Pacific, carrying the hopes and fears of a nation on its shoulders. Recall was possible, but it risked confusion, loss of morale, and exposure to intelligence leaks. Tojo, standing at the head of the table, spoke with a sense of urgency that seemed to echo through the room. "We have delayed too long," he said, voice sharp with controlled anxiety. "Our enemies are mobilizing. The Americans are building their fleets, fortifying their bases. Each day we wait, the balance shifts further against us. If we do not strike now, Japan will face a war it cannot win." The debate had once been philosophical, morality versus strategy, caution versus audacity. But by this point, pragmatism dominated every argument. The leaders were trapped by circumstance. The pressure was compounded by intelligence reports indicating that the U.S. Pacific Fleet might soon relocate, dispersing key targets and rendering months of meticulous planning useless. There was no more room for hesitation. History would not wait for indecision. Even within the Navy, nerves were fraying. Pilots trained endlessly. Aircraft were armed and fueled. Crews rehearsed the attack in meticulous drills. The human machinery of war was poised at the edge of execution. Any delay now risked compromising cohesion, coordination, and the element of surprise. Yamamoto, the only voice to have fully grasped both the operational brilliance and the moral peril, argued that the strike must proceed while conditions were favorable. Waiting, he knew, would invite disaster. The council recognized that the decision to strike was as much dictated by circumstance as by desire. Japan's leaders were acutely aware that postponement might present a theoretical option for diplomacy, but at the cost of strategic opportunity. In their minds, inaction was a guarantee of eventual defeat, while bold action, though risky, offered at least a chance at control. By midday, the debate concluded. The sense of inevitability hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Japan's leaders, under immense pressure and constrained by dwindling resources, understood that the attack on Pearl Harbor was no longer a question of choice. It was an urgent, desperate imperative. They had no other path that promised survival. That night, as Tokyo slumbered unaware, the carriers sailed on a course toward Hawaii. Every decision, every calculation, every vote had led to this moment. Japan believed it had no alternative, and soon the world would witness the consequences of a nation pushed to the brink by time itself. The die was cast. The war in the Pacific would erupt at dawn. As December 7th, 1941, approached, an uneasy tension gripped the Japanese high command. Hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor was set to unfold, a flurry of last-minute communications and orders were dispatched across the Pacific, revealing a leadership beset by second thoughts and moral uncertainty. What was meant to be a swift, decisive strike had become tangled in a web of hesitation, doubt, and the lingering voices of those who feared the consequences. Within Tokyo's war council chambers, some generals and admirals continued to wrestle with the morality of the impending attack. The intelligence reports, meticulously analyzed, had confirmed the U.S. Pacific Fleet's vulnerability. But the cost of war with a nation as industrially mighty as the United States weighed heavily on their minds. Letters, telegrams, and coded dispatches were hurriedly written, edited, and sent across the miles, attempting to delay or alter portions of the operation. But the logistical realities of a coordinated carrier strike meant that timing was everything. The carriers had already sailed, the planes were armed, and the pilots were briefed. Even the slightest delay risked undermining months of preparation. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the strike force, received one such message late in the evening, urging caution. Doubts had crept in among some elements of the high command. What if the attack provoked a war that Japan could not sustain? What if it failed? What if thousands of Japanese lives were lost in vain? These questions haunted every decision, echoing like ghosts through the naval offices and war rooms. Yet, the message arrived too late to truly alter the course of action. The carriers were already hundreds of miles from Pearl Harbor, and every attempt to reverse orders would sow chaos among the crews and pilots, who had trained endlessly for the operation. Within the corridors of power in Tokyo, the emperor remained silent, his position deliberately ambiguous. His silence allowed debates to continue. But it also left key decision-makers grappling with an uncomfortable truth. Once the attack began, there would be no turning back. The moral weight of initiating a preemptive strike against a powerful neighbor pressed heavily on the shoulders of men already burdened with the fate of a nation. Despite the doubts, the decision was ultimately made to proceed. The messages urging reconsideration had arrived too late to influence the outcome. The war machines, from aircraft carriers to fighter planes, were already committed. Radios crackled with last-minute confirmations, and the strike force continued its journey toward Hawaii. The meticulous planning and synchronization that had defined months of preparation could not accommodate hesitation. The element of surprise, crucial to Yamamoto's strategy, depended on absolute commitment. Any reversal now would risk not only failure but catastrophic exposure. For those in the Japanese command, the late messages symbolized a bitter reality. Evente best-laid plans cannot escape human doubt. Men who had trained, calculated, and strategized now faced the haunting consequences of their own moral questioning. Some officers stayed awake through the night, contemplating the irreversible path they had set in motion, aware that history would soon judge their courage or their recklessness. By the early hours of December 7th, the carriers were in position, their pilots prepared to launch. The messages of hesitation remained in envelopes, unread or only partially considered. Japan's leaders, despite lingering doubts and moments of second thought, had allowed the momentum of war to carry them forward. The die had been cast. At dawn, the Pacific would witness the terrifying efficiency of the Japanese strike. Pearl Harbor would be devastated, thousands of lives would be lost, and the United States would be thrust fully into a global conflict it had long sought to avoid. The messages sent too late, filled with hesitation and caution, served as a stark reminder that in war, timing is everything, and inaction, even for the right reasons, can be as consequential as action itself. History would remember the decision not for the doubts or the moral questioning, but for the devastating reality that unfolded in the first hours of December 7th. The consequences of delayed reflection would be measured in lives, ships, and the inexorable march of global war. December 7th, 1941, dawned over Pearl Harbor with a deceptive calm, the still waters reflecting the first light of the Hawaiian morning. Yet beneath that serene surface, the fate of nations teetered on the edge of a single decision, a decision made, in part, because a last-minute debate in Tokyo failed to halt the machinery of war. The Japanese High Command had argued, hesitated, and questioned the morality of attacking the United States, but ultimately, the momentum of planning and preparation carried the strike forward. What followed would change the course of world history forever. In the hours before the attack, Admiral Yamamoto's carriers, already hundreds of miles away from Oahu, began final preparations. Pilots checked their instruments, reviewed target maps, and received last-minute briefings. The air was tense but precise. Every calculation had been made with meticulous care. In Tokyo, the High Command, haunted by the warnings, second thoughts, and dissenting opinions, could do nothing to reverse the impending assault. The messages urging hesitation had arrived too late, mere echoes against the unyielding reality of operational logistics. The debate that might have spared Japan from an irreversible course of action had already been rendered moot by timing and the rigid structures of war planning. The attack itself unfolded with shocking speed and precision. Waves of Japanese aircraft descended upon the unsuspecting U.S. Pacific Fleet, catching sailors, airmen, and civilians off guard. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were struck by bombs and torpedoes. Planes were shot down, and chaos reigned on the harbor. Yet, even amid this carefully executed destruction, the seeds of Japan's own strategic misjudgment became apparent. While the strike inflicted immediate damage, it galvanized a nation that had previously clung to isolationism. The United States, onsei sitant, now found its resolve hardened, and a war that could have been delayed indefinitely erupted fully. The debate in Tokyo, fraught with moral questioning and second-guessing, highlights a profound truth about the nature of history. Sometimes the course of events is shaped not only by action but by the failure of inaction. The generals and admirals who had hesitated, who had dared to question the wisdom of striking first, could not halt the momentum of months of preparation. Their caution, though morally compelling, collided with the ruthless efficiency of military planning. The strike that should not have happened, at least in the minds of some, was executed anyway. setting the stage for a global conflict of unprecedented scale. Historians often look back at the Pearl Harbor attack as a turning point, not only in World War II but in modern military strategy. It serves as a stark lesson in timing, decision-making, and the consequences of ignored caution. Had the Japanese High Command acted differently, delayed further, or heeded the dissenting voices, the trajectory of the Pacific War might have been radically altered. Instead, the debate remained just that, a debate, and history recorded the irreversible results of the decision to strike. The aftermath was immediate and profound. Thousands of lives were lost, fleets were damaged, and a nation once hesitant now entered a war with full force. The attack united Americans in purpose, led to rapid mobilization of industrial and military might, and ultimately contributed to Japan's eventual defeat. The moral, strategic, and political consequences of a single debated decision rippled across continents, affecting the fates of millions. Ultimately, the strike that should not have happened underscores how close the world came to a different historical path. A single high-stakes debate, filled with warnings, doubts, and second thoughts, could not prevent the unfolding of one of the most consequential attacks in modern history. It reminds us that in war, the combination of timing, momentum, and human decision-making can irrevocably alter the world, leaving a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of courage, hubris, and the delicate balance between hesitation and action. Pearl Harbor was not just a military operation. It was the culmination of a debate that nearly changed history, and the consequences of ignoring those doubts reverberate to this day, a permanent testament to the power of decisions made, and those delayed, at the highest levels of command.